Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to this session. This is Disruptive Technology 1, one of a series of sessions about socially disruptive technologies. I think that's how everybody interpreted the concept, that we're talking about socially disruptive technologies. And we have three speakers today. First speaker is Ibo van de Poel from the TU Delft, and he will study about the role of technology in conceptual disruption. Ibo?
Thank you, Philip. Welcome everybody. Good to see that there are still quite a few people so early in the morning in this very big room. So I will be talking about how to study the role of technology in conceptual disruption, and I've summarized that in four theses, four statements, and I'm going to defend why I think these are good statements. So the first one is that I will claim that if you want to study the role of technology in conceptual disruption, technology is mainly disruptive because it creates novelty. It creates something that does not exist yet. So there are many ways that technology is disruptive, but I think there's a kind of common denominator. My second claim will be that we can understand, or should understand, conceptual disruption in terms of conceptual repertoires, not in terms of single concepts. Third, I will argue that conceptual disruption is best analyzed as a process, not just as a moment. It sounds like a moment, but I think it is better analyzed as a process. And finally, I will argue that conceptual disruption should be understood in terms of meaning-giving and not as a causal process. So I hope that there's something to disagree with this statement, because then I can learn something from you. Okay, so, well, technology has a disruptive potential because it creates novelty. So how would Plato react to a vacuum cleaner? Now, what type of novelties might we be talking about? So this is not meant as an exhaustive list, but I think we're talking about new entities, like the vacuum cleaner for Plato, new phenomena, like friendship online, new options for actors, new practices that are created through technology, and new types of moral problems. There might be even more. Now, why do these create conceptual disruption? Well, let's first look at new entities and new phenomena. So they may create what I would call, and what others have called, like Guido, classificatory uncertainty. So we see something new, and we don't know how we should classify it, given our existing conceptual schemes, and there might be what has been called a conceptual gap. So it doesn't fit in our conceptual repertoire. I think there can also be cases in which something maybe fits in our conceptual repertoire, but it fits in multiple repertoires, so it can be conceptualized in different ways. So then you might have classificatory ambiguity and a conceptual overlap. But there can also be cases in which maybe each of us is more or less certain, but we disagree. So different people might classify differently. So I think these are some of the ways we might understand why new entities and phenomena are disruptive. And it might create a felt need for new disruptive concepts. So similarly, if we talk about new options for actions, new practices, new moral problem, I think the normativity created there is at least in part more normative or evaluative, so how to evaluate these new practices, these new moral problems, and how to act. So there might be uncertainty, there might be forms of what I will call misfit. We might feel, okay, we can apply this concept, but it doesn't really get to the core of what's at stake here. There might be, again, disagreement between people, and the felt need for new and evaluative concepts. So, of course, this is very short in a nutshell, but I hope to show that there is something common here, namely we're facing with something new, and we don't know how to fit it in our conceptual schemes. And I think that's to my mind, the core why technology creates or can create conceptual disruption. So let's go to my second thesis. Conceptual disruption should be understood in terms of conceptual repertoires, not single concepts. Now, why is this? So the reasoning here goes roughly as follows. So first I would say, at least that's the way I think about concepts and conceptual repertoires, that there might be slight changes in concept. Maybe every time that we apply a concept, we might change its meaning somewhat. So slight changes in concepts are pretty normal. There's nothing special about it. It's happening all the time. But if we talk about bigger challenges, it always has to do, I would say, as well, and I think someone like Guido also has argued it has to do with the inferential relations between concepts. So what is changing is not the individual concept only, but also its relation with other concepts. Or you might also say, by changing the concept, we change its relations. So I think all bigger kinds of changes have to do with relations, inferential relations between concepts. And I think that means that if we want to understand what a conceptual disruption means or how it works out, we need to look not at individual concepts, but at conceptual repertoires. Now, what do I mean with conceptual repertoire? So I mean roughly something along these lines. So I would say it's a cluster of concepts that references some relevant part of the external world or the external part of human society. So it refers to something externally outside. It also contains the inferential relations between those concepts. And I'm assuming a kind of functionalist approach to concepts. This conceptual repertoire serves certain functions for us. Can be representative functions, can be functions for reasoning, can be functions for more evaluation, can be more specific functions relating to managing risk, for example, in technology. But conceptual repertoire serves certain functions. Now, if you accept this, I think three characteristics of conceptual repertoires are important, also in relation to a conceptual disruption. First, conceptual repertoires might have a certain coverage. In the next slide, I will define a bit more precise what I mean with coverage, but they have a certain coverage. They cover some part of the world. They have a certain coherence, given their inferential relations, and they have a degree of functional fitness. They more or less fit to serve certain functions. So here's a first attempt. I must say this is all work in progress, and I'm just starting this, so it can all become still more precise maybe. So with coverage, I roughly mean the degree to which the concepts in the conceptual repertoire individually or jointly cover, or which means refer to, the relevant entities and phenomena in the world. And this coverage can be greater or bigger, but can also be challenged by new things that we encounter. So with coherence, I roughly mean the degree to which the various concepts in a conceptual repertoire, as well as the inferential relations, form a coherent whole. You might, for example, sense that we don't want to have internal inconsistencies or ambiguities within the conceptual repertoire, or at least that goes at the cost of the coherence. And functional fitness roughly means something like the degree to which the conceptual repertoire is instrumental in fulfilling certain social functions. So you can see that all these might be challenged by new concepts. I will come to that in more detail. Okay. This brings me to my third statement. Conceptual disruption is best analyzed as a process, not as a moment. So why do I think this? So I think the word disruption, at least to many of us, has this kind of meaning. Maybe even if you look in the dictionary, it has the kind of meaning of like a punctuated change, something that happens at a specific moment in time, and there is the disruption. But I think if we study conceptual disruption, if we look closer at it, certainly in relation to the role of technology, we better see it as a process. And I think this process is triggered by the novelty of technology, but, and this also comes to my fourth statement that I will defend, it only gets off the ground, or it only happens because people react to this novelty in a certain way. So we have to understand why something is, so I would say something is not inherently conceptual disruptive. It becomes conceptual disruptive due to the way how we deal with it. So I would say conceptual disruption is the outcome of this process rather than the input of this process. It's something that comes out of the process in reacting to the novelty of technology. So just to be clear, for me, so the way I understand it, the novelty itself is not a disruption. It actually triggers the disruption. But whether it even becomes a disruption depends on how we deal with the novelty. So just to explain this a bit more, how this might evolve, and there might be different ways. But for example, if we encounter a new entity, the reaction might be to extend the coverage of our conceptual repertoire. We might just treat the new entity as part. We might fit it under an existing concept, or we might combine concepts. We might fit it in our existing conceptual repertoire. But then, interestingly, what might happen later on is by doing this that we create lack of coherence in our conceptual repertoire, or less of functional fit. And I would argue that here the conceptual disruption is the result of this reaction. So it is not just the sheer fact that there is this novelty, but also how we have reacted to it. So let me give an example of what I have in mind to make it a bit more concrete. So we have, at some point in time, we had new computer systems that different from other existing computer systems, were more autonomous. They ruled themselves. They were interactive. They were adaptive. And some people at that point in time started to ask the question, how should we classify, how should we conceptually understand this new type of computer systems? Are these still computers as we know them, or are they somehow agents? And one term that has been coined by people and has now become rather common is the term artificial agents. So these are computer systems which are autonomous, interactive, and adaptive. Basically, it's a combination of two existing terms, namely artificial and agent. And I would say it by and large means that we extend our conceptual repertoire to capture this new phenomenon. But now I would say what happens, and people might disagree to some extent with my analysis here, but I would say that one of the things that we're facing is that by introducing this new term and fitting it in our existing conceptual repertoire, we found out that there is some incoherence in this repertoire. We have introduced, maybe not deliberately, but on effect, some forms of incoherence. For example, artificial agents have other inferential relations with other concepts like responsibility and intentionality than human agents. So the effect of the way we reacted to the novelty is undermining the coherence of the conceptual repertoire. And you might also argue that, in effect, or related to that, also the functional fit of the repertoire. So this is less clear, at least I'm not entirely convinced that this conceptual move is helpful in dealing with the moral issues that these so-called artificial agents raise. So what's interesting here is that we see this, that we become aware that this conceptual disruption is not just this one moment, but this chain of events. And I would claim that conceptual disruption, at least if we understand conceptual disruption as a kind of social fact, is the result of this chain of events. So, to summarize what I said here in terms of a kind of, and I would phrase it as a hypothesis, so it is not so much a novelty or the new phenomenon that's disruptive as such. It becomes disruptive because how people react to it. And if we look at this, what I would call the downstream effects are maybe more important to understand why it is disruptive than the initial reaction. Okay, let's go to my final thesis. Conceptual disruption should be understood in terms of meaning giving, not as a causal process. Well, for those who watch carefully, you might have seen that I'm already talking in these terms a bit, but let me explain a bit more why I think so. So I would say conceptual disruption is at least partly, or maybe mainly, the result for how humans react to this novelty. I said this before. And this reaction is a result, or implies, I would say, a kind of meaning giving of humans to that novelty. It's even possible that people don't recognize the novelty. So people might not see something as novel. And then you might have no disruption. I actually think that there can be disruption without people recognizing a novelty. For example, if people react differently and you get disagreement, you can still get disruption, I think. But the core point here is if we want to understand conceptual disruption as a process, we should understand it in terms of meaning giving. Or meaning giving is an important element of it. Now, and like I said this before, the downstream effects are here important. So the meaning attached might trigger the conceptual disruption and the conceptual change. And I think we should be here liberal that there can be very different kind of mechanisms that work out. So let me, in ending, say a little bit about how we might study what I would call mechanisms of conceptual change. And I take here a particular idea of mechanisms, namely the idea that's, for example, found in analytical sociology, also assuming a form of methodological individualism, and they use what has become known as Coleman's boat. So the idea is here, if we want to understand a macro-level phenomenon, and my argument here is that conceptual disruption is a macro-level phenomenon, that we should not understand it directly at the macro level, but we should understand it going to the micro level of individuals. And you have different types of mechanisms that are often distinguished, like the situation mechanism, which is about how the actors react to the macro level phenomenon, for example, the novelty. An action formation mechanism, how the individuals change their behavior, and a transformational mechanism, which is about how this adds up to something at the macro level. So just to be clear, I understand the novelty created by technology and how it relates to conceptual disruption as a macro-level association, which we need to understand through mechanisms at the level of individual, at the micro level. So just to, what does that look like? So if we take roughly the same example that I gave, at the macro level we have this phenomenon that we have new types of computer systems. This is being interpreted by people. For example, they might feel classificatory uncertain. That's a reaction to the macro phenomenon. And then they might individually react. They might, for example, propose this notion of artificial or agent. And then, if this notion is taken up by others, it might result in a change in the macro level. For example, an extension of the coverage of the existing conceptual repertoire. And like I said, this again might trigger an ongoing process and maybe another mechanism of conceptual disruption. So people might, in response to this changed conceptual framework, conceptual repertoire, and more problems that are there, they might perceive a misfit between these. That's a form of perception. And they might react to it. For example, they might articulate the dissatisfaction with this repertoire or with this notion of artificial agents. They might mobilize others, which might lead to an understanding of conceptual disruption as a social fact. So, this is my presentation, and I think we still have some time for questions.
Indeed. Are there questions? Yes, I see Guido.
Thanks for this, super interesting. I was thinking about the composition of concepts, like artificial agent or brain death, right? So in the case of brain death, you really chose, we chose death as a concept. And then brain is just kind of an addition, like a specification. Whereas artificial agent, as you explained, I would interpret it as we didn't actually pick agent. We call it agent. But it's not the concept of agency, it's not the concept of agent, it's a different concept, which isn't agent, because it doesn't have responsibility and all these things. Right? So it's just, we call it agent. It looks like a conceptual decision to make it like an agent, but it isn't, because of exactly what you said, the inferential relations are different. So, that's how I thought about it.
No, I think I agree with you that artificial agent is not an agent, but I think at the same time, and that's maybe also has to do with the lack of coherence, or maybe the interpretation of the specific case is in that sense a bit different. I think at least some people interpret it as agent. So I think at least some computer scientists will interpret it really as agent in the more traditional sense. You might say, okay, they mistaken, but at least it means that this move is also, in a sense, ambiguous what it means to call something an artificial agent, because not everyone might interpret the notion of artificial agent the same. So I agree with you, but I would also say, and I think that's just part of the unfolding story, that we might invent this new term, but it might actually stand for different concepts for different people. So I think that's part of what's happening. That's exactly what I mean in terms of my more general claim that it is not a moment, but that we need to interpret how this evolves and what happens. And indeed, people, so I don't disagree with you, but I think this is part of the dynamism that comes into being once we have this initial reaction. Yeah.
We have time for one more question.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I found it interesting. I was thinking this might sound something, I don't like a Wittgensteinian response or something, but how much is this like conceptual disruption just a symptom of kind of over-theorization or over-philosophy from philosophers? So for example, like you might have like a digital example of friendship, a digital form of friendship, and an Aristotelian might say, oh, this isn't really friendship because it's not, following, it's not building upon the virtues or whatever. But then someone might say, well, no, I get some meaning out of this, and I want it to be part of the conceptual scheme of friendship. But really, it's some kind of other emotion that's triggering this.
Yeah.
And this is really just a response of kind of over-theorizing from a philosophical perspective.
So I'm not sure I fully, but I think and I think it is a bit similar to what I discussed in response to Guido. I would say, so we have this new phenomenon, and it might look like friendship. Some people might be inclined to call it friendship. They use words like friendship online. They might, and at the same time, these new terms. So also what I partly want to say is that sometimes it initially seems rather simple how you react to the novelty. Namely, you just invite this new term, friendship online. But then philosophers and others find out that actually that trick doesn't work in the sense that it undermines coherence or undermines functional fit. So that's actually kind of core of what I say, that so even if we make this kind of seems conceptual invention or terminological invention like friendship online, that's not the end of the story. It's actually the beginning of the story of why this is problematic.
Thank you very much, Ivo. Our next speaker is presenting a paper co-written with somebody else. So we have Jeroen Hopster from Utrecht University and Elizabeth O'Neill from TU Eindhoven. They are the joint authors, and the presenter will be Jeroen Hopster. Jeroen, take it away.
Thanks, Philip. Thanks. Very nice to be speaking in this beautiful auditorium. So this is a bit of a different topic, the good, the bad, and the disruptive. And I want to say a few words about the promise of niche construction as a theory for technology ethics. This is joint work in very early progress with Elizabeth O'Neill. Basically, what I'll be saying is my original take on the topic, and we're going to take this further then jointly and see what comes out of it. My interest in niche construction has been there for a while. I did a PhD on the evolution of morality, and I've always thought that niche construction would be an interesting kind of framework to think about the evolution of human morality. And then later on, I discovered that some people have a joint interest in this as well. I've sparred a bit on this with John Danaher, with Elizabeth. I know that Guido, as well as Sabrina Konings, have been quite seriously thinking about niche construction as well. We've worked on it in the context of an SDIT project on techno-moral revolutions, where we don't really work out the concept in much detail, but we thought a bit about techno-moral niches, right? So there's been this idea that thinking about niches and niche construction, it might be relevant, specifically also in the context of technology, but perhaps more work needs to be done to flesh out how it can be relevant and what it entails precisely, right? So what is the promise of niche construction theory as a framework for studying and evaluating technological changes in society, in particular in the domain of social morality? That's the general research question and the background here. So, briefly, the kind of basics here. What is niche construction? Well, the core premise of niche construction as a theory as it has been developed mostly in evolutionary biology, is that organisms are not only shaped by, but actively shape their living conditions, thereby co-determining their evolutionary fate, right? Work by Kevin Lala, John Ottling-Swie, Feldman, right? That's the general starting point for this kind of discourse, though there are earlier roots with Richard Lewontin and others as well. So that's niche construction, and that's the sort of default paradigm, let's say. Moral niche construction is one of the more specific ways in which this general framework has been taken in new directions. I would say that over the last 2 decades, there's actually been an interest from several disciplines to sort of take up this niche concept, in particular also cognitive sciences. What are cognitive niches, right? So the idea of niche construction, it has extended beyond the field of evolutionary biology, and this niche concept has been taken up in multiple other disciplinary discourses, including some scholarship on technological change, which has also adopted and worked with this notion of niches, right? So moral niche construction, as a starting point, is concerned with the scaffolded moral environments in which moral norms are differentially retained and transmitted. And then thinking about moral niches and thinking about the roles of humans involved there, you almost inevitably arrive at techno-moral niche construction, because or technological scaffolding of the environment is so central to on one hand human morality and also to human evolution, right? So there's a natural move to thinking about what techno-moral niches involve, right? So at first pass, in a techno-moral niche, the human-modified environment, partially constituted by technology, influences the moral development of agents within the niche, as well as natural and cultural selective forces to which individual and group morality is subjected, right? So that's sort of the move from niche to moral niche to techno-moral niche, right? Now, one challenge in thinking about this niche concept in general, I think, is to cope with, let's say, the enormous spread and dispersion of this concept across disciplines, right? So on the one hand, it's been a very sort of successful traveling concept that has been able to move from one discipline to the other. But on the other hand, one might think, well, if the concept is so broad and is used in so many different contexts, there's little specificity to it, right? Isn't this concept too vague to provide us with any kind of theoretical mileage, right? So what is its use really, right? So I think that's a general challenge here. And I think one at least useful starting point to addressing this challenge is to go along with Sabrina Konings and her distinctions between different spatial temporal skills at which one might usually think about niches. So Konings distinguishes between 4 of them in a paper published in Philosophical Studies: a phylogenetic or selective skill, so that is to say, phylogenetic or selective niche construction, that's really an evolutionary process. It refers to collective modification of environmental features through the activities of a population, leading to alterations of the genetic pool of that population, right? So that's a genetic process as it has sort of traditionally been understood in evolutionary biology. But evolutionary processes involve much more than only genetic inheritance, right? There's also a social level, there's cultural inheritance, so, and we might think of niches also at this sociogenetic or developmental level. So sociogenetic niche construction, in Sabrina's words, would refer to the collective modification of the environmental features through the activities of a population, leading to alterations in heritable phenotypical properties of such a population. And then there's also niches at even more specific small scales, let's say. There's ontogenetic or personal niche construction, basically how we sort of modify and mold and amend or environments over the course of our lifetime, let's say. So this refers to an individual's idiosyncratic engagement with their environment, leading to alterations in phenotypic properties along their lifespan. And at even the smaller scale, what Sabrina would call microgenetic niche construction, this denotes singular environmental modifications in the here and now, leading to local alterations in the dynamic organism-environment coordination, right? So that's very much, us being in this present room and how we might sort of be able to sculpt our niches in the current, present, here and now, right? So very different spatial temporal skills here. One might, of course, challenge this categorization. I think that there might be a bit of a gap between the sociogenetic scale on the one hand and the ontogenetic scale on the other hand. I mean, there's a huge sort of space between that, so we might want to be a bit more specific still, and we might think about things differently. But at least at first pass, this provides a bit of a sort of grasp on this very sort of wide-ranging discourse on niches that has been out there. And it would be interesting also to think about potential tensions that can arise between these scales, right? So perhaps you might be sculpting a certain ontogenetic niche, which might be in some conflict with the sociogenetic niche, right? And that might be, there might be sort of interesting tensions that result from that. So when I'm thinking about techno-moral niches, I typically think about these at the sociogenetic level. And well, what might they involve? Well, for instance, institutional resources, which include our existing moral institutions, legal, economic, governance institutions. Epistemic resources, including our conceptual repertoire, are, I think, an important aspect of what a niche consists of. Material resources, of course, or energy resources, food, etc. And our technological capacity, understood very broadly as the ability to transform resources in order to satisfy human aims. Right? So you might think of these as the kind of background conditions against which new moral norms and new moral practices take shape. Right? And the specifics of these background conditions, they influence what kind of contents these new moral norms might acquire, right? So that's the idea, right? And I think this is an idea that's actually quite familiar and resonates with naturalistic accounts of moral development, moral evolution, right? As you might see, for instance, in the work of Owen Flanagan, his work about geographical diversity of morality, or the work of Buchanan and Powell on the evolution of morality, right? I think that all these accounts, they can mesh quite well with this idea of moral niche construction, even though they're not framed in these terms. Now, a bit more on the role of technology. So technology, one might think of technology as having a causal role in moral niche construction, right? A moral niche, recall, is a scaffolded environment that is culturally transmitted and inherited, in which particular moral norms and institutions are likely to evolve and persist. And what is important, I think, about the role of technology, or what I find helpful at least, is to think about this in terms of stabilization and destabilization. Right? So moral niches can be stabilized by enduring technologies, as well as other kinds of institutions, if you want, perhaps also qualify this as technologies, right? Frameworks of knowledge, conceptual systems, material resources. These can all sort of stabilize or techno-moral niche. But more niches or techno-moral niches, they can also be destabilized. For instance, through technological change, which might be triggers of moral disruption and revolution. Right? One case study of stabilization, in which I will briefly go over, I've done so in the past for perhaps some of this audience, so apologies for that, but that's been the case of the plow, which we've discussed in our 2022 paper on techno-moral revolutions. So how the plow as a technological artifact has managed to stabilize a certain techno-moral system. And cases of destabilization, I mean, one example that comes to mind is the work of Nicholas Smith on the shift from natural order values to emancipatory values, and the role that, for instance, the printing press played in this, and this might be a sort of destabilizing technology that has actually served to overcome a certain moral niche and disrupt it, and to move towards a different kind of moral niche. So let's look at the plow as an example of a sort of stabilizing technology. Right? We have to go back now millennia, right? Where there were systems of shifting cultivation, that is to say labor-intensive cultivation using hoes and digging sticks, right? And that's a kind of cultivation that if that kind of cultivation is in place, then typically the labor is done by both men and women more or less on an equal footing. In societies that have developed and adopted the plow and used the plow in agricultural processes, there's been a shift. So a plow cultivation involves equipment-intensive cultivation, and in cultures that have adopted the plow in farming, plowing tends to be mainly a male activity, whereas women are disproportionately given domestic tasks. There's work by Alessandro Alessino, the economist, who's done very influential work on this in several papers, very robustly corroborated by all kinds of evidential sources. And what is interesting, what Alessandro has found and really persuasively argued for, is that cultures which traditionally had plough cultivation tend to have, over the long sort of arm of history, so actually with sort of lasting effects through the course of millennia, have had more inegalitarian gender norms and less female participation in activities outside the household than societies that have traditionally had shifting cultivation, right? So the idea is here that plough societies, so to say, have been at the basis of different kind of social moral systems than cultures that did not use the plough in agriculture, right? And there's actually quite a good amount of evidence that that corroborates this thesis, right? So we interpret it in terms of techno-moral niche construction. One might say the following: the type of farming technology that is used, it creates a cultural niche, a modified environment that alters which behaviors and norms are transmitted, which affect the extent to which inegalitarian gender norms develop, right? So the idea is also that, for instance, a lot of cultural practices, for instance, practices around marriage, etc., I mean, they all sort of go in the same egalitarian versus inegalitarian direction, depending on the kind of more the material substructure that is in place, so to say, right? So in this niche, in the niche where men plow the fields and women work in the home, in this niche, norms promoting that men plow the fields and women work in the home will be more likely to persist than norms which recommend equal division of labor, right, as said. And once these inegalitarian gender norms exist, they may lead to the further development of institutions and practices which further encourage the persistence or development of inegalitarian gender norms, right? So the idea is that once this sort of this kind of stable system is in place, then we have further norms sort of developing on that basis, right? Okay, that was an example. Now let me ruminate a bit in general terms. What are the benefits of employing techno-moral niche construction as a sort of lens to think about the role of technology in moral systems? First, dialectically, I think that one of the benefits here is to emphasize both the constructive as well as the disruptive aspect of technology. And I think that dialectically that's relevant because especially in the context of the STIT program on ethics of socially disruptive technologies, there tends to be a lot of emphasis on disruption, which is, of course, very interesting and relevant, but we shouldn't forget that stability and stabilization, that's also an interesting counterpart to think about, right? So we might also want to have stability as an important explanandum, and I think this niche construction framework helps to sort of shift attention more in that direction. There might be explanatory benefits. I think that the theoretical framework of niche construction, it can sort of help to underpin discourse on techno-moral change, right? It can help to better understand examples of techno-moral change, such as the plow, the pill, other examples we discussed in that 2022 paper. It draws attention to important feedback loops in human social morality, let's say, and it connects with other explanatory frameworks on how human morality changes over time. There might also be predictive benefits to it, right? So there might be a way in which this kind of thinking can complement anticipatory technology ethics, right? I mean, one example from Elizabeth is the proliferation of digital recording technologies in our current day and age, which facilitates unbounded moral judgment, right? That might be an example of how technological change might actually have an impact on moral change, which might already, hints of it might we might be able to distill them in the present, but it's partly also a prediction about how morality will evolve, right? So it provides a bit of a theoretical basis to make certain kind of predictions, and potentially even strong predictive claims, right? This is what historian Ian Morris has done in his thesis about how energy systems have been strong determinants of the kind of moral systems that humanity has evolved. And then lastly, perhaps there might also be some normative and evaluative upshots. So if technologies can stabilize and destabilize moral systems, right, then we might think about ways of designing and governing technologies that are conducive to stability or to disruption, right? There might be some applied use of that. And I think this whole way of thinking invites reflection, axiological reflection on the value of stability versus change, right? So what is the value of retaining stable techno-moral systems? What are the risks of niche disruptions, right? With have a few minutes left, so I can briefly touch on that as well, right? So the value of stability, right? So as said, moral niche construction, it involves stabilization of certain social moral norm systems, etc. Stability can, of course, be valuable, right? I mean, collectively as a society, a reasonable degree of social stability, it constitutes a precondition for many kind of activities we want to undertake, for the functional organization of society, one might say, right? It facilitates joint action and collaboration, it makes planning possible, etc. And individually, something similar holds. Though, of course, you know, a sort of a threshold level of stability should be satisfied. It's not necessarily the case that more stability is always for the better, right? Social instability can negatively impact the functioning of individuals and institutions. So often lack of stability, niche disruptions, one might say, that's a concept that Guido Leur has been advancing. They typically come with transition costs, with a sort of decay, with a loss of functional organization, even if these niche disruptions might ultimately be for the better, right? So I see there a link also between some of the recent work that I've been developing together with Joel Anderson and Björn Lundgren, for instance, on how social disruption should be understood in functional terms. And I think that this niche construction framework also provides a certain lens to help thinking about that in terms of the value of stability and the disvalue of lack of stability. Right? One objection to all of this is that this account might seem to rely on a very technologically deterministic view that overlooks all kinds of relevant insights that have been developed in this community in particular, right? In the history of ethics of technology, STS, the more constructivist accounts that have been developed there, right? And in reply, I would say the following: we don't want to be more deterministic than it's warranted, right? But we also don't want to be more constructivist than is warranted. And I think that our thesis about the role that technology can have in stabilizing moral systems, it can simply be seen as an extension of the thesis that technology is value-laden, that it makes certain moral norms more accessible and cheap, and others less accessible and more expensive, right? Which is not to deny that other constellations might be possible, but it might be more difficult to achieve. And I think that there's actually good evidence with regard, at least to certain case studies, that this is the case and that a kind of moral lock-in can occur, right? So I'm exactly at 20 minutes now, so that seems an opportune moment to wrap it up. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, I see already three. I don't know who, I think you were first. But, so this is actually a microphone. Can you?
Yeah, I'm familiar with that. One thing about niches, I was sort of wondering about the scale, because when people use niche as an adjective, like, you know, that music was really niche, usually it refers to something kind of small that's in a, you know, enjoyed by a relatively small or specific population. But some of the examples that you gave is like society-wide. So is there any constraint on scale?
Yeah, I mean, the example you give, for me, that's really a different use of the term niche, right? So I think these shouldn't be conflated, right? So that's very niche in the sense of a certain sort of group of protagonists using it. Whereas niche construction, it's very much about scaffolding the environment in which a certain, which gives rise to both affordances and constraints of the practices taking place in that environment, let's say. I think that might be the most general way to put it. I think that's a different word of the use, niche, right? So, yeah.
Thanks. So, I don't know who was first.
Hi, this is a fun little toy. Okay, so it's been a while since I've done some reading in biology or ecology, but if I remember correctly, one of the defining characteristics of ecological niches, for instance, is the fact that there's limited resources and they're kind of ranging over physical environments where a bunch of different species have to kind of fit in. And you had on a slide, you were talking about epistemic resources and norms as resources, but those don't strike me as limited in the same way. They're not constrained physically with respect to, like, you know, it's not like if you believe some moral norm, I don't get to do it. So that seems like it has a big effect on how niche development occurs, if that makes sense. Or maybe I don't understand niches, that's also possible.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if I agree with your first point that limited resources is inherent to the niche concept, right? So I mean, niche construction as an idea, the essence of it is really that there's agency involved in the kind of environment, so that organismic agency plays a role, basically has sort of implications for the selective factors through which evolutionary processes occur, right? So they're not merely sort of passive recipients of selective pressures, but they can actually influence their environment and thereby sort of influence their evolutionary trajectory. I think that's the starting point for thinking about it. And I think there's not necessarily scarcity involved in that conceptualization of it, right? I might be mistaken, so I would be interested to hear more from you in that case, but yeah.
Okay, thank you. Very interesting talk. So I'm wondering what the relationship is between this way of thinking about morality and kind of different views in metaethics, right? So typically we see evolutionary biology as kind of debunking, in some sense, morality. So if I accept this niche idea and I start using this, is that committing me to constructivism or nihilism or relative? Can I be a realist about morality and think moral claims are true while at the same time using this sort of framework?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. So I know that there's been a little bit of work on this by Eleonora Severini, and I mean, she used this kind of niche construction framework in the context of evolutionary debunking arguments, which, if I recall correctly, at least means that she's probably not a realist, but a constructivist of sorts. I'm not sure. I would have to think about this in a bit more detail. As you are probably aware, I mean, the options in metaethics are endless, and there might be a way of, carving out a realist position that is quite compatible with niche construction. But at first glance, let's say, yes, I think in this whole kind of naturalistic outlook towards moral evolution, it will be a bit more easier to square with constructivist positions than with realist positions. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Hello? I think so. Yeah, no. So I decided to do the iconoclastic thing without a PowerPoint. Hold on. And I'm going to talk about disruptive innovation. So having lost all faith in grand narratives, the rhetoric of the European Union at the start of the millennium revolved around grand challenges, which should be met, as the original Lund Declaration made clear, through leadership in R&D, driven by a collaboration of public and private stakeholders. Is there? Plug it in, There's not a PowerPoint. Oh, I thought there was. Yeah, I just said so. It's okay. No. See? The disruption. Okay, so the rhetoric of grand challenges did not last, but the challenges did. Today, they commonly go by the hackneyed formula of wicked problems, or alternatively, and often in the same breath, as deep yet wishfully transient crisis. Whatever the frame, however, realities such as climate change, immigration, socioeconomic inequality are world disruptive. Importantly, innovation is cursorily invoked as the boulder to stem all evils, the principal, if not sole force, capable of countering the disruption. Thus, for example, when the 21 EU proposal of regulative guidelines for the AI Act urges the creation of a legal framework that is innovation-friendly, future-proof, and resilient to disruption, its aim was to preempt the disruption generated by AI itself. However, the vagueness of the aspiration betrays the hope that AI shield us from disruption tout court in general. Our last line of defense in the face of world disruption is the most disruptive technology we can conjure up. Unable to counter, let alone overcome the disruption, we aim to disrupt it. Perhaps, however, there is a logic to this mad, desperate act. Perhaps this is logic itself, the same logos that speaks in technology. To disentangle its yarn demands much more than a single talk can, of course, deliver. I have chosen to focus on disruptive innovation because this pervasive yet often unexamined notion has shaped and continues to inform our effort to confront the emergent and the new, the uncertain and the unknown. In the following, I offer a critical outline of the theory of disruptive innovation, and I then turn to Jacques-Luc Nancy's diagnosis of world disruption in order to thematize innovation anew. 1. Disruption theory, the limits of a conceptual innovation. In the mid-90s, Clayton Christensen and a group of collaborators established the field of disruption theory. Its most detailed elaboration came in Christensen's 1997 monograph, The Innovator's Dilemma, the subtitle of which, When New Technologies Caused Great Firms to Fail, foretold the straits that the theory would have to navigate. Using the term disruptive technologies that he and Joseph Bauer had coined a couple of years earlier to refer to technical innovation with an industry reshaping potential, Christensen's argument focused on the evolution of computer hard drives. As such, from the outset, disruptive innovation was intersectional, the innovation being technical, the disruption economic. In a nutshell, disruption theory argued for the seemingly paradoxical thesis that established companies can be driven to collapse by homing in on ever more refined and capable products. This is because established companies aim through sustaining innovation to fulfill the needs of their best customers who require and are able to afford the cutting edge of a given technology. By the same token, however, established companies overserve an increasingly larger portion of their customers and are likely to fail customers with modest needs and limited means. At this point of a simultaneous excess and deficit in the face of existing demand, disruptive innovation occurs. The introduction of a technology which is inferior to the state of the art, yet offers many existing or potential users attributes they value, including an accessible price. Having gained a foothold in the market, the new technology is then able to develop rapidly through sustaining innovation and overtake its predecessor, at least regarding those attributes that will attract the majority of mainstream consumers. At this point, it may be already too late or too difficult for established companies to adopt the new technology, precipitating collapse or reinvention of identity in a different sector. As this outline makes clear, despite Christensen's focus on a case of technological innovation, there is nothing inherently technological in the notion of disruptive innovation. Indeed, Christensen and his colleagues have repeatedly tried to reel the notion back to its original business and management concept out of which it emerged, to safeguard its theoretical sharpness vis-à-vis its prolific yet loose employment in various other contexts. Thus, for example, Christensen and his colleagues have painstakingly disqualified Uber as a disruptive innovation, notwithstanding the havoc wrought by the platform. What matters is that Uber's introduction did not appeal to the low end of an existing market or to an altogether new market offering a product of lesser quality with regard to key attributes valued by mainstream customers. Uber attacked the market frontally, directly replacing providers who did not overserve existing customers. Thus, for disruption theory, Uber is not a disruptive innovation, but an outlier replacing incumbent competitors through sustaining innovation the rapid ascent of which is best explained on legal and regulatory grounds. Interestingly, although Uber is thus disqualified as a disruptive innovation in the regular taxi market, it does qualify as such within the black limousine market, where Uber offered a service of lesser quality for a competitive price, undercutting an overserved market. Now, a second example may further gloss this perplexing set of qualification criteria. For disruption theory, the iPhone, just like Uber, constitutes sustaining rather than disruptive innovation, offering a better and more efficient product to existing mainstream users in the smartphone market. The iPhone is, however, a disruptive innovation with regard to the computer market, initially offering a subpar but affordable alternative to state-of-the-art options, gradually attracting a significant portion of users to replace computers with a smartphone. It is beside the point to query these inflections. What they clearly show is not only disruption theory's potential for misappropriation, but its overall limited scope. This was noted within business literature as early as 2006, when Konstantinos Markidis argued that despite revolving around technological innovation, disruption theory was a model of business innovation, distinct as such even from a theory of product innovation. However, despite the efforts of both its proponents and its critics to circumscribe it more narrowly, disruption theory virtually monopolized until recently the discourse on disruption, as well as a great part of the discourse on innovation. And yet disruption is ubiquitous. All is now disrupted, staking at once the new and the now. It is precisely the hope to think the creation of the new differently that has led to the flourishing in recent years of the field of responsible innovation. However, in disruption theory's terms, responsible innovation would have to be qualified as sustaining and never as disruptive. The quadruple helix of innovation, that is, the interweaving of government, industry, academia, and society, is geared towards incremental progress on the basis of existing models of innovation, and thus towards sustaining the existing techno-economic dispositif, first and foremost in the face of disruption. Thus, EU's aforementioned call for a legal framework resilient to disruption must be understood as a call for responsible innovation. And yet such prudence in the face of total disruption may prove insidious. If our current innovation regime has precipitated the sixth extinction and ecosystem collapse, among other forms of radical disruption, tempering its intensification will merely delay the inevitable. Even the most entrenched megacorporations and the most ensconced political elites recognize the cul-de-sac of business as usual. Disruption theory's success may be explained accordingly by its offering a model in which disrupting the disruption allows one to subsist in the midst of profound and permanent disruption. In this model, innovation emerges out of disruption, in the double sense of disruption being the ground whence innovation grows, as well as the engulfing quicksand that innovation must escape. At this juncture, I certainly agree with Jeroen Hupster's call for a thematic appropriation of disruption through its expropriation from disruption theory's managerial prerogative. For this, significant theoretical labor is needed. As long as we think of the world in terms of growth, and growth in terms of capital accumulation, we will only counter disruption with disruption. For ultimately, the tension that leads us to consider disruption as both the problem and the solution, the fear and the hope perpetuated by innovation, is a rearticulation of the dynamism that informs Joseph Schumpeter's theory of creative destruction, and with it, much of our economic thought. Among its many unacknowledged loans, disruption theory borrows from Schumpeter's metaphor of waves to conceptualize successive iterations of disruption. Whether one imagines marine waves flooding the shores of the market or terrestrial quakes making the latter tremble, no inherent qualitative difference appears to distinguish one wave from another. At the same time, the market, even as it collapses and rebuilds internally, abides as a whole in a quasi-ahistorical register, outside the logic of progression and progress. This is, however, half of the picture. Schumpeter's great insight was to infuse the static equilibrium models of Cambridge economics with a dynamism that opened them to the outside. As such, Schumpeter introduced metastability into a logic that knew only perfect stability as the end goal of markets, hindered by circumstantial, if perennial, disorderly flux. Thus, with Schumpeter, the economic system becomes porous, its interior shaped by the global history of its outside. This is ultimately a thermodynamic understanding in which negotropic order is only possible through an ever greater entropic expenditure of energy, with the cyclicity of waves embodied within the longer directional arrow of creative destruction. Indeed, contemporary Schumpeterians, such as Philippe Aghion, interpret this arrow as the promise of interminable growth, a history in which each wave of creative destruction leaves behind more employment and prosperity than the preceding. For this, one needs simply to manage destruction, thereby saving capitalism from the capitalists. Schumpeter himself, however, was less hopeful, predicting a bleak telos for capitalism, its growth ultimately undermining its own conditions of possibility. Today, we're confronting much that Schumpeter could not have foreseen. We appear to be on the cusp of a terminal disruption of our culture of abidingly salvaging disruption. Just like the alcoholic invested in determining the last drink, not the drink that will prove fatal, but the one before that. We seem to place all our hope, if any is left, in the last disruption, the last within our history of disruptions, still capable of prolonging the time that remains. We hope to disrupt disruption one last time. Now, world disruption and the novum, Jacques-Luc Nancy. For Jacques-Luc Nancy, it is not a mere hypothesis that the world is destroying itself, but a fact from which all thinking must proceed. This fact, Nancy calls the unworld, and disruption is, we may say, its mode of existence. In the phenomenological tradition, the world is neither a place nor a totalizable aggregation of things, but a horizon of meaning. Indeed, a world becomes a place and time only when one finds oneself in a state of familiarity with its sense. In modernity, the world frees itself from its obsession to an other transcendent order. While previously the sense of the world, just like the sense of any specific thing, was to be found outside itself, in modernity the world sense is immanent, fully contained within itself. Thus, in modernity, the world must experience all its revolutions, all its disruptions, as a constant turning against itself. Now, three principal world-disrupting processes can be observed. The first two constitute a loss or deficit in that the world can no longer be experienced as a well-composed ensemble, that is, a cosmos. Moreover, the world can no longer be ordered either at the universal or the local, natural, or cultural level. Any imposed order proves soon unmanageable and provisional. This double loss might be understood as a world dissolution, a cosmolysis. The third disruption manifests in an excessive, overwhelming proliferation as the world's material and cultural constituents diversify and pluralize rapidly. This unchecked multiplication appears as the cancer growth of insular world enclaves, that is, as a cosmocarcinoma. Nancy has indeed compared the world, or globus, to a glomus, which designates in botany an arbuscular mycorrhizal fungus, while in medicine, a tumor. The third disruption proceeds as the simultaneous proliferation of networks and cancerous growth. We are thus caught between the straits of a cosmolysis and a cosmocarcinoma. And yet we are forced to concede that there's never a thing that's entirely deprived of a world, simply standing there. If even the architects of disruption theory admit that it is rare that a technology or product is inherently disruptive, it is clear that disruption presupposes a world. We thus realize that we cannot be without a world at the very moment that we find ourselves deprived of a world. In order to begin repairing this antinomy, the logic of the techno-scientific regime of general equivalency must be explicated. The simultaneously epistemic and ethical abstraction of values, which allows their reciprocal translation, exchange, and replacement, establishes a regime of general equivalence, the simplest name of which is capitalism. Ultimately, convertibility is recognized as the most valuable of all values, a function assumed by money, which serves as measure and symbol of the general equivalency of values. However, we cannot simply trade in values. We cannot trade in suffering. We cannot trade in worlds. Just like our two hands possess their own microbiomes and bone densities, their capacities and habits, the worlds we inhabit are incongruent. Left and right are inconvertible at the corporeal and the psychic as much as at the political level. And yet worlds communicate and commune. They cannot be traded, yet they commerce. The disruption of their commerce is as important as any disruption in isolation. Now, a passage of Nancy may summarize the preceding and open to the remainder of this talk. To create the world means, immediately, without delay, reopening each possible struggle for a world, that is, for what must form the country of a global injustice against the background of general equivalence. And to conduct this struggle precisely in the name of this, that this world is coming out of nothing, that it is without preconditions and without models, without any given principle or end, and that it is precisely this that forms the justice and the sense of a world. In order to comprehend and survive the cosmolysis and cosmocarcinoma of the regime of general equivalence, Nancy's thesis on the creation of the world from nothing is decisive. The nothing out of which the world emerges does not precede or follow the world, but coincides perfectly and uninterruptedly with it. It is always there, always creative, but it is nothing. This is a radical materialism, which brings together all that exists as it composes itself into a world. From energy to deflagration, from gatherings to explosions, from molecules to cells, and from cells to brontosauruses, to quadrupeds, to hominids, to ziggurats, and to steam engines. What precedes has never seen the coming of what follows. Through this creative radical materialism, we must revisit the history of philosophy as well as philosophical anthropology. Since Descartes and Leibniz, the credo of the best possible of worlds shifted the sense of the world from reality to possibility. Within this new sense of the world, Homo faber appears not merely to precede Homo sapiens in terms of biological evolution, but much more decisively, Homo faber establishes from the outset the human species as a technician of itself. Through an incessant eco-technological labor, the human is denatured, shorn of its animality while at the same time nature becomes configured as an autotelic, non-technological domain distinct from human becoming. Technology is here the immemorial innovation that produces nature, just as Homo faber produces Homo sapiens. This production of nature serves across human history as a restraining power. However, gradually, human autonomy is left unopposed, producing not in order to supplement a perceived lack, but to augment the making power at one's disposal. The final aim becomes the creation of new, unheard-of worlds. Such creation is calculated, but not axiomatic. Its sole principle is its own capacity for self-determination, and thus not so much a logic as an energetics or a dynamics. This ecotechnical will, manifesting itself in ever more successful forms of production, transforms nature from the counterforce of technicity to a component of its power. Ultimately, all there is left is the technical self-accomplishment of existence, or said otherwise, automation. Automation is the absorption of physis by techne, the dissolution of their opposition. Cosmolysis is driven by the dissolving forces of technology, while its complementary fabricating forces drive cosmocarcinoma, which we can now reframe as the imperturbable automation of automation. Only a brute destructive force can disrupt the tumorous automation of growth. Only a counter-energetics may impede the energetics of automation. In the way of closing, I would like to inflect the above one last time. The human has always generated knowledge to escape uncertainty. The cunning of uncertainty, a phrase that Nancy borrows from Helga Notoni, former president of the European Research Council, has driven science, leading ultimately to autonomization of the logic of scientific discovery, in which the uncertain is gradually replaced by the unknown. The unknown designates here the impossibility of anticipating the conditions, elements, methods, and discourses out of which new knowledge will emerge. Thus, by producing knowledge, one produces the unknown, which includes among all it engenders the uses and dangers of its application. This is disruption at its purest, and it is integral to scientific discovery. It is also a double bind, for knowledge is applicable across unforeseeable contexts and towards incalculable ends, disrupting at once towards the good and the bad. At the same time, the process that produces knowledge cannot secure its destination. The two cannot be made to coincide, no matter how much responsible innovation attempts to align the wayward forces of the uncertain and the unknown. We cannot ignore either. The uncertain calls us to counter the consuming forces of life, the unknown to explore its miracle. However, knowledge production subsumes the unknown to the uncertain, reducing the production of the self to subsistence, the mere fact of not ceasing to be. And we lack even a language to think outside forms of knowledge that do not readily serve as instruments of policy and of management, of strategic orientation, results, financing, evaluation. What we must think is the ways that the unknown may disrupt the uncertain. This is no longer a task for philosophers, but a sine qua non for entrepreneurs, executives, bureaucrats, and politicians alike. The event has burst in where previously processes, calculations, and laws reigned supreme. This is then a call for a reparation of the disruptive commerce of the uncertain and the unknown. If, as Nancy insists, the impossible is to have a chance of happening, we must learn to see anew the unforeseen. We must look again at the amoeba, the skeleton, language, cyberspace, and our own self, and experience them as perfectly unforeseen. All is innovation. For this, we must break with the universe of management, in which disruptive innovation is only the ultimate twist to preserve the here and now, a desperate attempt to hold on to our dissolving privilege. Thank you.
I see one question. Where's the microphone? You got it? Okay. Just throw it. Guido?
Thanks. That was super interesting. I wanted to go back to the very first sentence and ask you what you intended by this sentence. The one about like how the EU Commission rejects the notion of meta-narrative for meta-challenges or something?
Yeah, so, you know, this is a thesis by Lyotard, right? So we live in the age of where the grand narratives are over, right? Obviously, grand narratives is not a term that the EU ever used. So, but if we say, okay, grand narratives are over, but how is it that the EU at the same time talks about grand challenges? You know, what is the relation of those challenges to those narratives? I mean, do those grand challenges not constitute sort of narratives of their own? So I think there is a tension there, you know, where, you know, yeah.
But when you say that the challenges kind of presuppose implicitly these narratives that are still kind of there, I wouldn't consider the EU Commission as very postmodern.
No, neither would I. Yeah. But first of all, but you know, we can operate within an intellectual space without us kind of subscribing consciously to any of its principles. So, for example, you know, we do not believe that, let's say, there's certain kind of values that are unconditionally universal. I mean, it is difficult, right? Because on the one hand, we do have that Enlightenment kind of background, right? And in a way that constitutes our European identity. And at the same time, we're saying we cannot, you know, we cannot impose those on the rest of the world. And yet, the way that we configure the challenges is informed by our ascribing, but perhaps to a certain extent, to certain narratives, at the very same time that these narratives seem to become eroded and not. Does it make some sense?
Yeah, but I'm also gonna.
Yeah, I mean it's a big one. Yeah.
We can talk about it later too.
Other questions? Yes. Can you get me? Okay.
Well. Not really a question, but a request. Can I have your paper, please?
Yeah, sure.
Because it's a lot.
Yes,
and,
yes.
It seemed very interesting, so.
I'll gladly share it, of course. And actually, there was a longer version of it, and I sort of condensed it for the purposes of this.
You certainly have.
Yeah, but my gesture, just to recap maybe in a minute, like I believe that you know, we have this idea of disruptive innovation, where like it's on the lips of many agents, and yes, I have a problem. I don't feel that you know, where the concept comes from actually has any purchase on what we're trying to think, and on the other hand, yeah, I think that we need new resources, and that's sort of what I've tried to do, and to think also disruption in the broadest possible terms, right? Because you can talk about a very specific market, like the hard drive market, but what happens to the rest of reality as, you know, this market is being reshaped? And that's why I went to the kind of broadest thing that I could find, like a world. What happens, and then that opens the links to ideas of conceptual disruption, right? Because if it is the sense of the world, of course, you know, we're talking a slightly different languages, like from an analytical perspective and a continental perspective. But ultimately, we're talking, I think, about the same thing, like conceptual disruption being integral to.
So that brings us to the end of this session. Let's thank our speakers again.
Ja, boven voor openstellen. Ja, oké. Ja, ik moet... Nee, ik ben... Ja, nou ja, dus... Ja. Ik heb even direct na die uitgezocht. Dan zou je moeten hebben. Nadenken namelijk. Ja, dat ook een land in de dat is niet waar ik nog op twijfel. Ja, hoewel ik tegelijkertijd als je processen wil becijferen, dan moet je in de aard. Dat is ook een feit om te zeggen, dat is de rijheid. Niet zo.
Okay, welcome. We're going to start with the second session now, still on the theme of disruptive technologies, and it's my pleasure to announce the first speaker, Christa Laurens.
Thank you. Let me start this. Okay. Thank you so much for attending my talk. I do want to say as a disclaimer, when I sent in the abstract, I think I might have been a bit ambitious in what I promised. So it turned out that I will be sharing with you work in progress that at some point will hopefully turn into a publishable paper together with my supervisors, Vincent Blok, Nolan Gertz, and Bernice Bovenkerk. Having said that, the title of my talk, Exploring AI Through a Husserlian Lens, Would Husserl Still Write the Crisis Today? I hope that this will make more sense as I progress through the presentation. The structure of my talk, what I'll do is I'll very briefly situate my work, say something as to why return to Husserl, share with you how I've developed or how we're working on developing a Husserlian lens. I'll do so based on my reading of Husserl's The Crisis of European Sciences and Transcendental Phenomenology, and relate this all to AI. So, very briefly, my project is part of a larger research consortium, of which many people also in this room are a part. The theme is socially disruptive technologies, and my project focuses on digital technologies, their disruptive nature, and to approach this through the concept of the live world, which is something that I think allows us to look beyond the impact of individual artifacts on individual users and sort of look beyond that towards a broader impact on the live world, of which I'll say much more. So, my research question is, do digital technologies disrupt the live world, and if so, how? Of course, everything hinges on the meaning attributed to the central terms: live world, disruption, digital technologies, and for this work that I'm sharing with you, at least the latter has been somewhat specified to AI. So, given this question, I think it's also very briefly, without going into a sort of whole history of philosophy of technology, recently there has been a rehabilitation of ontology as opening up worthwhile avenues for the philosophy of technology. This is sometimes referred to as the ontological turn. Work on this is being done by Peter Lemmens, Vincent Blok, but also many others. And I think generally speaking, you could situate my work here as well. So, for those of you who are not familiar with Husserl, very briefly, he was trained as a mathematician, studied, like Freud, under Brentano when he switched to philosophy, and he became the founding father of phenomenology. He had a very strong influence on 20th century philosophy. Perhaps his most famous or infamous student is Heidegger. And in contemporary philosophy of technology, for instance, someone like Don Eide very explicitly goes back to Husserl, actually wrote a book on technology in the live world. And after my presentation, I hope it's clear why I think that it is still worthwhile to actually go back to Husserl's work himself and the way in which he presents the concept of the live world in The Crisis. So my motivation for doing so has to do with the method that Husserl practices and his specific analysis of the relation between science and the live world, which are intertwined. You cannot really separate those two. So, as the title makes abundantly clear, the European sciences are in a crisis. Husserl writes, in our vital needs, so we are told, this science has nothing to say to us. And the source of the crisis is a specific relation that has gradually emerged between science and the life world, where, for instance, or an important characterization is the life world as the forgotten meaning fundament of natural science. Husserl characterizes the life world in very many different ways. I think this passage already contains quite a lot, so I'll briefly read it out. He writes, thus, in whatever way we may be conscious of the world as universal horizon, as coherent universe of existing objects, we each, I the man, and all of us together, belong to the world as living with one another in the world. And the world is our world, valid for consciousness as existing precisely through this living together. We, as living in wakeful world consciousness, are constantly active on the basis of our passive having of the world. This requires a lot of unpacking, but the basic idea that we already see emerge here and also in connection to other passages in the crisis is that there is a sense in which is captured by this passive having of the world. We are always already in a meaningful environment. The life world is the world of experience. It's also that which is in principle experienceable. It's both the ultimate ground and meaning horizon of human life and activity, but importantly, it's the result of functioning subjectivity. And I think here is also captured the idea of the historicity of the life world. So we always already have a sense of the life world in this way, but this requires an unpacking, or we need to not take this as a given, but we need to interrogate how it emerged. Okay, because if we do not do so, then we end up in a crisis. And a very important development, because basically Husserl's analysis of the relation between science and the life world is that science does not acknowledge its dependency on the life world. There's a kind of reversal that occurs, which Husserl traces back to Galileo's mathematization of nature, and especially the latter part in the first quote where he writes, "It is through the garb of ideas that we take for true being what is actually a method." So the point that Husserl is really trying to make is that natural science, for which geometry was a very important discipline, that it is ultimately grounded itself in the life world. So what motivates geometry is itself a pre-geometrical motivation. Ultimately, Husserl traces this back to the art of what he calls surveying, so measuring up land, which I think is very interesting because then perhaps geometry is itself rooted in a sort of economic concern, but that's debatable. So the mathematical order is itself an abstraction, which is made possible by the life world. Also, scientists themselves continually make use of the life world. So the life world is not just the domain of the subjective relative, is how Husserl sometimes refers to it, that needs to be overcome by science, but it is something that actually continues to be active for scientists all the time, in the sense of scientists acting in communities of human beings working together, and the actual tangible instruments that we use, and the sense in which any prediction that we make needs to be, or for which the life world is ultimately the source of verification. So basically, the scientist keeps relying on the life world, but does not acknowledge this dependency, and so there is a sort of forgetfulness of the life world, as it were. Then I'll briefly say something about the method that Husserl practices. I think something which clarifies this a lot can be found in The Origin of Geometry. It's an appendix to The Crisis, which was actually made quite famous by Derrida's reading of it. And here Husserl writes, to put it more precisely, that is the cultural present, implies a continuity of pasts which imply one another, each in itself being a past cultural present. And this whole continuity is a unity of traditionalization up to the present, which is our present as a process of traditionalizing itself in flowing static vitality, making geometry self-evident then, whether one is clear about this or not, is the disclosure of its historical tradition. So I think here very clearly we see this idea that we always already have, the life world is given to us in a way. We naively pre-give the life world to ourselves. And we need, in order to overcome this situation, we need to practice phenomenology, practice this method of genetic phenomenology, trace the historical tradition. And then what this allows Husserl to do, I think, is to show how the crisis that he identifies is actually the result of a very narrow understanding of science, that this is an understanding of science where science is reduced to factual science, and he finds a different model of what science could be, which is something about which I could say more, but I don't necessarily think that's necessary here. So what I think I can take from this and sort of build towards his Husserlian lens is this method of genetic phenomenology. So basically unsettling sedimented layers of meaning by identifying deep-rooted beliefs, assumptions, the things we take for granted, and uncovering their history. So basically looking at the life world as the domain of the things we take for granted and to unsettle this taken for grantedness. And also, I think Husserl's analysis of Galileo's mathematization of nature is a very clear case study of this. And also, of course, Husserl's analysis of the relation between science and the life world, and the reminder not to forget the ontological primacy of the life world. Okay, so here I am going to switch to AI. And so what I think this allows me to do is that by building on towards a Husserlian lens or framework, this allows us to look at the way in which digital technologies such as AI disrupts in a different way, namely by tracing what could be those deep-rooted beliefs that, for instance, in the crisis, Husserl traces to a very dominant, prevalent understanding of science, which he critiques for being a very narrow understanding of science. So what I want to point out is that something interesting that I found is that there was a report published a couple of months ago on how individuals utilize generative AI nowadays. And what was very interesting is that they found that generative AI is not merely a tool for efficiency, but it is increasingly becoming an integral part of human decision-making, creativity, and emotional support. So as you can see, the top 3 use cases of AI are for therapy, companionship, organizing one's life, and finding purpose. So basically, questions of very fundamental human concern, ethical, existential, are now by individuals being directed to generative AI, such as ChatGPT. But I think we see something similar, perhaps also on a more on the collective level. Here, I want to point to what we could call the transhumanist dream, which is that at the center of the future that is imagined by the transhumanists, A friendly AI aligned with human values guides civilization wisely, ensuring that progress remains tightly coupled with the flourishing of humanity and the environment. And I think that sort of this same way of thinking you see in sort of what might seem like the opposite sentiment, which was expressed in the OpenAI letter, where, for instance, we read, should we develop non-human minds that might eventually outnumber, outsmart, obsolete, and replace us? Because even though here this is formulated antagonistically or to AI, I think the idea is that if we invest enough in AI to make sure that it is aligned with human values, then it can take this role that we see in the other quote. Now, of course, I think it's possible. I think very many people here will be very critical of transhumanism, but this kind of thinking we also see, for instance, in official documents by something that I found was published by the United Nations Academic Impact Initiative in anticipation of the centennial, the 100th anniversary of the United Nations. And one of the contributors, which turned out to be an MIT professor, writes, we have seen a shift from executing instructions by humans to replicating humans, outperforming humans, and transcending humans. So what I think, or at least what I see in these ways of thinking and talking about AI, this would seem to point to the deep-rooted belief that AI is or will be able to make better, more rational, more objective decisions than humans. Despite evidence to the contrary, there's a lot of critique on the bias of AI and, for instance, the famous case of Compass and recidivism. So here, a disruption of the life world would be, in fact, a disruption of the life world as the domain of that which we take for granted. So it is not necessarily something that stands out to us immediately, because already perhaps we are taking this for granted, and I think looking at this through a Husserlian lens actually points us to the necessity to interrogate then this assumption. And also, I think this raises the question that, similar to Husserl's analysis of science as abstracting from the life world, how does AI and datafication relate to the life world? How does this affect our cultural present, our way of experiencing the world, our life world? So circling back to the beginning, where I asked the question of would Husserl still write The Crisis today? I mean, I do have my own intuitions on this, but at the same time, this is still very much work in progress, so I think it raises a lot of questions. A different way of putting the question would be to ask, did we overcome the crisis Husserl identifies, or are we still in it? How does AI relate to this? Because if we remember from the beginning of my talk, the crisis that Husserl identifies has everything to do with the fact that science is not responsive to life. In asking questions of fundamental human concern, it does not have anything to say to us, Husserl wrote back in the 30s, in the previous century, whereas now we see development where people do actually turn to for instance, AI in posing these questions. So is it actually a solution to the crisis, or a continuation or intensification of the crisis that Husserl identified? Is there a third option? Yeah, I don't have answers to this, but I'm very much looking forward to your questions and feedback, and yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Questions for Krista?
Yes, thanks a lot for your talk. I was wondering if you're interested in the role of AI in relation to the live world. What is the place to look? And let me explain. So the way I interpret Husserl is that he says, if you look at the natural sciences, mathematics, that's actually grounded in our experience of the live world, and and I would say similarly, a lot of AI, generative AI, is grounded in the live world. But if you want to see how it is, you actually shouldn't look at the use of generative AI, but at the generation of generative AI. And that basically happens with all these human annotators and annotating AI text, which is grounded in the live world. So I'm wondering, is the site to look at how AI relates to the live world, maybe not much more all these unseen data workers, rather than the users of generative AI?
Ah, okay. Yeah, thank you so much, Ibo, for your question. I do think that the point that you raise is very much in line, I think, with Husserlian analysis of AI, because indeed, precisely the work that is being done by humans in order to produce the data on which AI runs shows precisely this groundedness in the live world. Yeah, so that is something that would need to be included in my account. At the same time, I do also think that sort of this way of thinking about what AI can do, and sort of this very deep-rooted conviction that the outcome of AI will be more objective and in that sense transcend the subjectivity of the human, that this is still very prevalent today. And whereas this, I think from Husserlian perspective, it allows us to question this look on, or this undervaluation perhaps of human subjectivity in distinction to a certain understanding of objectivity.
Next question, Andreas Bahn.
Yeah, thanks. Great talk. I have a question about kind of the normative function of the live world in the whole argument. To be short, I enjoyed reading Husserl. I did it way too late in my life, and I recommend really reading Husserl. It's a great author, especially his Philosophy of the Rigorous Science or his Cartesian Meditations are really brilliant. However, in his later work, the Crisis work, there is the distinction between an ontological primacy of the live world, and which then science is an abstraction. But the question always is the ontological primacy, does it come with an epistemological primacy or not? Right? Because you could think, yes, of course, science is a late abstraction, like the theory of relativity is a very late abstractive work, but it's probably more correct than our assumption of similarity in the live world. Similarly, you say that many of the beliefs then make it back into the live world and become part of the live world. So where does kind of then the normativity come from? Yes, there is the idea that we need to challenge the beliefs, but the mere fact that they are historically developed and are late abstraction themselves doesn't imply that they are false. So there's something where I sometimes struggle with the late Husserl, where the normativity actually comes in. Maybe you have some ideas about that.
Thank you, Andreas, for the question. I think it's a very good question. It's also something that is critical, I think, to the work that I'm trying to put Husserl to. I don't think I have a conclusive answer. I think a lot of people have written on, well, precisely this tension that you identify. Yeah, so the question that you asked is about the ontological primacy of the live world, whereas at the same time, even though, well, scientific insights emerge historically, yeah, this does not mean that they are false, indeed, like you said. So, I mean, I think there is this dual sense in which Husserl uses the live world that, indeed, if we want to explain the event of natural science, then we cannot do so on the basis of natural science itself. So basically, I think for Husserl, the motivation for any kind of scientific endeavor would, in a way, always be pre-scientific, and this would be precisely its groundedness in the life world, and in that sense, science has to be responsive to the concerns rooted in the life world, and I think this is where the normativity comes from. And at the same time, of course, Husserl was very impressed by all of the progress that science has made. So his point is not to say that we cannot trust the insights of science. I think Husserl was very much impressed, for instance, also by the work of indeed Einstein and relativity theory and whatnot. But it's more on, I think, sort of understanding, making sure that our understanding of science does not become sort of entangled with or leads to the moment where we replace the life world for a construction or the garb of ideas, what Husserl talks about. I hope that answers it a bit.
Thank you very much, Christa. There's more questions, but we're out of time, so I hope you can discuss them during the break. Thanks again. And then we will move to our next speaker, Professor Wiebo Haukes.
Okay, great. Thanks for joining the fifth Netherlands-based philosopher talking about disruption in this great room. You'll see a couple of, say, familiar moves even in this talk, if you have been in the disruption section all day, because I'm going to retrace and in a way reformulate some steps that have already been made by others. Yeah, and I scratched out the deep in the last rehearsal of this talk because there's really nothing deep that I'm going to do. So, what will I do? I'll quickly go over some of the recent work that has been done by philosophers on disruptive technologies, and I'll, like some of them, focus on conceptual disruption. I'm going to then identify some open issues and propose a partial resolution. And for that, I'm going to draw on some work that has been done on, say, social ontology, because I think that there is a very productive combination to be had there. Okay, so the rehash part. As you presumably all know by now, philosophers have taken some insights from disruptive innovation theory, which originally was coined in an economic context to talk about the disruptive effects of technologies on markets, where Jeroen Hofster urged us to broaden these ideas to include social, moral, and existential dynamics, which is a pretty good idea, I would say. And then along came Guido Leur, a bit later, saying that, well, within that broader scope, there is a particularly interesting and important kind of disruption going on, which is classificatory. So a disruption or a challenge to established classificatory norms and practices. So this is one of the many disruptive effects that a technology could have. And there are some poster children for that, like effects on concepts such as death or nature. This was the entire recap. So now for some open issues. What I think this line of work could, well, at least see some further development is in how exactly is this disruption occurring? So think of Ibo's third thesis. If we don't think of this as a moment, but as a process, what actually is the process? So Jeroen wrote, okay, so we shouldn't insist on a strict distinction between technological and non-technological agents. Instead, we should look at the entangled socio-technical dynamics. I think, again, that's a pretty good idea, but let's do a bit of untangling there. Guido wrote, in terms of the effects, an action, event, or artifact is conceptually disruptive if it prevents a certain classificatory equilibrium. But then again, sort of what is the underlying process there? How does an artifact, for instance, have that preventive effect. And then just one slide on depth. So if we're interested in deep disruptions, and I think most people are, because yeah, if you can choose between the shallow and the deep, why not go for the deep? What is remarkable in the papers is that they pass the buck on depth. So they say, okay, the disruption is deep if it affects something that was deep in the first place. So that was a fundamental concept or some, say, something at the heart of our self-understanding, etc. I think it would be interesting to see if we can call upon a process that could be considered a deep disruption, which doesn't automatically presuppose depth. And then again, in passing, I think the last quote on the slide, Guido refers to something of a process, or the outcome of a process, namely a community being forced to make a classificatory decision. What is that forcing there? Okay, so I think I have something like 15 minutes left. I need to do this disentangling of the socio-technical dynamics. So how much of that can I actually do? Because obviously this will be a very, very complicated process. It's even, I think, passingly unlikely that there's only one process going on here. There must be a lot. But I can minimally hint at one. And that process, it's about concepts that are almost, by definition, deep. Namely, it's concepts that are about us. So classifications about human beings or our actions. And what I'm going to draw on is an analysis given by Ron Mellon about how some classifications of humans and their actions come to be highly significant, even causally significant. So significant that they can, in his terminology, be called humankinds. And I'll explain his framework. So I think no one can disagree with the fact that we apply classifications to ourselves, to each other, to our actions. The question, of course, is which of these categories really matter? What Mellon does is say, well, some matter a whole lot, in the sense that they are so stable and can be called upon in epistemic practices that they serve as humankinds, much like some kinds do in the natural sciences, natural kinds. So think of this as the social science counterpart of natural kinds, in that these support explanations, predictions, or interventions. And I think interventions, also if you're interested in something like conceptual engineering, as a counterpart of work on conceptual disruption, I think you need to call on something that you can actually intervene upon, and that you know what sort of the intervention mechanism could even be. Now, Mellon submits that if you think through how some of these classifications come to have this stability and causal significance, you have identified something that is more than a mere category. By this, he is, by the way, not at all referring to a humankind that has a biological basis. So I think his work is very easily misread as such, but as you'll see, he emphasizes the social construction that is going on here. So how does that work then? Take some category C, influencer, professor, or so. Some of these categories come to reliably guide our thoughts and actions. Again, not because they have a biological basis, but because of another constructive process. What then? Well, for one thing, what is needed here is that some community has a set of shared beliefs, Mellon calls it common knowledge, but I think knowledge is a slightly misleading term here. Shared beliefs about who is a member of that category and what category members typically do. And also what others typically do in interacting with these category members. And it's not just that everyone has that belief, they also believe that everyone else in the community has the belief. If you have that, you can start socially coordinating on the basis of that category. Does it need to have a biological basis? No. There needs to be a sufficient, say, epistemic basis for it, in the sense of people knowing stuff about each other. So one element in turning categorical representations into humankind is common knowledge. And then there's other stabilizing mechanisms, according to Mellon. The third one we've already heard about in Jeroen's talk. So this is environmental construction. Not just in the sense of material modification, but also in the sense of the construction, institutionalization of certain norms, which might just institutionalize the common knowledge, by the way. But there's more. So what people in the community, category members and others, can start doing is to intentionally, for instance, strategically, act in line with the common knowledge about the category members. So in their self-presentation, their self-understanding, they perform certain social roles, so to speak. That's the strategic, intentional part. The second one is we are perfectly capable of internalizing all of this. So latching on to even slight perceived differences between people in order to trigger in-group preferences and all kinds of implicit biases. These are all stabilizing mechanisms, leading to something like this schematic process of how, from a categorical representation, take again sort of influencer, or a categorical representation that we don't think will make it into a humankind, presenter at this session. What do you need more than the representation? You need this common knowledge, and you need the stabilizing mechanisms. In Mellon's account, there's a sort of intermediary here, which is a social role. Not so sure about that, but okay, let's take that in stride. This is a social construction of humankind. Nothing here refers directly to technology. And the only thing, my own 2 cents on this is, now let's add the technology. Because I think it is not too difficult to, with some philosophy of technology 101, to find some places where technology could impact this. Okay, one is obviously, if some technology becomes available, there's some technological development, we might come up with new categorical representations or tweak those that are already there. And I think we've also already heard about that. And so this is a kind of inducing effect that the technology might have. Think again of influencer, which was sort of just used as a label to describe some people dealing in a particular way with a technology, but also with each other. So this is one effect that technologies could have. But in terms of this schema, there's another one, namely the common knowledge. So a technology could play a pivotal role in the community formation and the information exchange within this community to form the basis of common knowledge. And I think, again, influencer is a case in point, because this knowledge about, okay, who is an influencer? What should you do as an influencer? Who's allowed to call themselves an influencer? It's exchanged via social media itself. And of course, any sort of effect that the technology has on the formation of common knowledge is far less specific to a particular categorical representation than the inducing effect is. So I think we are looking here at a sort of potentially more widespread disruptive effect of a technological development. Finally, quite obviously, technologies play a role in this stabilization, in the material modification, for instance. Leading again to the formation if all factors contribute of a causally significant representation that we can draw upon in epistemic practices. And to, for the last time, use influencer as an example, is it epistemically important? So is it causally significant? And I just ran a very quick search on Web of Science looking for papers that use the concept of influencer. And I'll show you the citation profile of influencer, which is a very healthy one indeed. So this is it. So influencer started its scientific career a bit later than I did. So early 2000s, and it really took off. It has an age index of well over 130, which shows how apparently productive it is to call upon this categorical representation in an epistemic practice. Of course, I didn't check the quality of all these papers, but it's clear that it has some epistemic traction. All right, I think only 2 more slides to go. So you might not like this talk about only technology constructing the humankinds. You might not even like the idea that there are these humankinds. But I think you can very readily turn Mellon's schema on its head to say that in all kinds of ways, technologies could also have a deconstructive effect on humankinds, a destabilizing effect, which could then also be conceptually disruptive if it goes all the way to these humankinds. Because that would be my candidate for depth here. What distinguishes a deep disruption, at least in this realm, from just a shallow one, is that it goes beyond a categorical representation up to humankind. And I think, but this is just a thought, I could even call upon notions of explanatory depth to explain what is a really deep, an unsettling kind of humankind. So what I've done is to just show you one process via which some technologies could have at least a class of conceptually disruptive effects, namely through this socio-technical construction of humankinds. And that combines work on conceptual disruption quite nicely with work on social ontology, I would say, where it's striking how the conceptual disruption work has, I think, largely overlooked some of the work that is going on there, and vice versa. It's striking how little Mellon refers to technology in his account of how humankinds get socially constructed. So hopefully you also think this is a productive idea. I would be the first to agree that there's a lot of work still to be done, but I guess that's only for the better. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Questions? I'll start at the back.
Thanks, this is super interesting. I was thinking during the talk, so first I think there is a social, I think there is everything we do is kind of social ontology, but you're completely right that there's actually also, even in social ontology, so I'm going to the social ontology conference in Dublin soon, and pretty sure there's very little about technology, almost nothing, and vice versa, right? Like I do have a social ontology, so.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So I do consider myself, I connected to the joint action literature. So I also, I think it's really interesting. But I was thinking your project, it sounds to me like conceptual. You're talking about, like the way I think about it, you have this conceptual disruption, and that needs an account, completely right. But it's more like, okay, just kind of, you don't really know what to call it. And then what you're talking about is this like conceptual engineering part, where you introduce a new term like influencer, and that term takes off. And it just kind of has a causal influence on all kinds of practices, and it creates impacts the epistemic practices and stuff. And then that causes further social or conceptual disruptions, right? So I'm not saying, I'm not like minimizing the work, right? I'm just saying like that is, but I think like thinking about it in terms of, okay, that is first of all a conceptual engineering paper, you know, in my mind.
Yeah, what I try to do is to mainly give a kind of descriptive account, or drawing on the descriptive account of how this process of establishing humankind works. And of course, by telling you how it works, it opens up a space for, okay, you see, the sort of, you look under the hood, so you see places to intervene. I still think sort of much of what I've said could be taken as a mere explanatory project. So just to explain how some disruptive effects come to be. But yeah, I mean, it's not for nothing that under the use for epistemic practices, I've also mentioned intervention. So yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Super helpful to bring kind of these two domains together. Can you go back to the slide with the different ways in which technology, like the little, the schemata. Just a question for clarification. The first category seems very clear to me, right? Kind of influencer is not possible without social media technology, and that kind of how the term takes off. The second one was kind of the shaping of common knowledge. And there I was wondering whether your example, whether you could explain it a bit more, because there could be two ways. The one is whether social media shaping of what an influencer is just kind of the way in which this is communicated is via the medium, but that doesn't have to shape it, right? It's kind of, but I think you seem to be saying more there. So I'm just a question for clarification. How could there be more than just kind of a transfer of information?
No, you're absolutely right. Sort of, I think there is a specific way to read that. Just the exchange of information about influencer on social media, which I think is the pool of common knowledge. And I've also, I think for 10 minutes, I looked up some sources there somewhere on one of the bonus slides, where people tell each other, okay, this is what you need to do in order to call yourself an influencer. Or, well, you shouldn't call yourself an influencer, because if you call yourself an influencer, you aren't one. So there's also this strange sort of doubleness to the information exchange and the hiddenness of the category. But the point I was also trying to make is that social media as such has a disruptive effect on all kinds of formations of common knowledge. So it's, I think, how common knowledge nowadays about many of the new categorical representations, influencer, but also a lot of others, how it gets established.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, this was really fascinating. I was just curious, maybe this is too far afield, but if we took this from a more Marxist perspective, then all of this, ironically, given what you were talking about with depth, this would all be superstructure, right? So if we were to look at the base, then we would say, you know, if we really want to talk about categorizing humans, we would do it on economic class. And then how does this fit into that way of thinking, right? Because then presumably something like influencer would have a very different meaning if we were to look at it from a sort of Marxist lens, where all of this would be ideology.
Okay. Yeah, I think that is it's sort of it's really too, but I can respond. Yeah. So in a way, this account is both about quite shallow categories and the deep one that you are referring to. Because I guess for Marxists, there is a lot of epistemic significance to uncovering that particular humankind. Yeah, or class structure, membership of a particular class. So I think, I'm not sure whether all of what they are doing fits the descriptive metaphysics that is going on here in the sense of common knowledge. Yeah, so who is the community that has led the categorical representation of people as some members of a class all the way to a causally significant humankind? I wouldn't know. It's probably not those people themselves, but it's the others categorizing them. So that should have, I guess, some impact on the applicability of this schema, but I wouldn't know exactly what. But thanks.
think I have time to chime in one question from myself. I think a very interesting presentation. I'm quite persuaded by the relevance of this kind of account to think through conceptual disruption. I wonder, when it comes to common knowledge, should we perhaps also try to add to this schematics the possibility that knowledge communities might not align on what qualifies as the category, right? So I mean, influencer might not be the best example, but there's potential for friction there, right?
Yeah. No, so I think I didn't touch upon a process of disagreement at all. Or sort of, I guess people starting to even use the same categorical representation on the face of it in very different ways. Perhaps leading to a split up between humankinds or a disagreement about a particular humankind. I wouldn't really know about that. I guess because I focus so much on the constructive aspect of it, bringing in that conflict, I guess it can be done, but I would need to think about exactly how. I would probably sort of latch onto it in terms of the community formation and the formation of a sufficiently shared basis, where I would then say that there is a fragmentation of the community going on. But at least sort of the schema allows me to ask that kind of questions or to phrase the questions in a particular way. So I guess even if it is not complete in representing everything, it gives a nice set of representational tools to disentangle the process a little bit.
All right, thank you very much, Wiebe Haukes. And then we move to our next and final speaker of this session, Guido Leur.
But is the microphone on? Here, you too. Okay, good. Do I have to press something? Like the USB-C? This is going to go actually in Nolan's direction. Really like the question. Sorry. Yeah. I'm going to make a very simple point. So I have 15 minutes, right? And 5 minutes for Q&A. It doesn't work. Choose me. I'm going to make a very obvious point to some people, like Nolan, for example. But I think in Ested we don't talk about it so much. Okay, wait.
Choose whether you mirror or extend your display. You should have an option.
I actually have a Mac.
It should have a pop-up, actually.
If you go to the top menu on Mac, then click on the screen, and then screen mirroring.
There you go.
I can just do this.
Start mirroring.
Now we see what else.
Perfect. Thanks. Now you see on my messy desktop. So a different title from what I initially said. Ibo. So I'm really curious about why AI is so conceptually disruptive. And it kind of started with my flatmate, Lukas Fuchs, who's also used to be in Eindhoven, and he continuously reminded me how Ested is not political enough. So I think he's completely right about this. So I tried to pick up this challenge. And my favorite example is this one. Some of you know it. So it's this TV show called Humans. It's about basically robots. Anita is a service robot, and she does the homework. She takes care of the kids. And there's the guy on the right is called Joe. And the woman on the left, from the left, her name is Laura, and they're married. And at some point, Joe, in a desperate moment, he's engaged in a sexual activity with Anita. And the question is, well, was this, given that Anita's a machine, is this adultery? Laura thinks it's adultery. Joe thinks he's really surprised by this classification. He thinks it's masturbation, right? And that's morally, of course, very relevant in this like very deep sense, because if it's adultery, it's morally bad. But if it's masturbation in our society, it's completely fine. It's a private thing. Adultery is a public thing. If we even say a robot can be a person, was it even consentful? Because what Joe did, he pressed the button, and then Anita had to basically, suddenly she became attracted to Joe, and well, is this masturbation or is it abuse? Right? So depending on how you classify it, very different moral and political consequences follow. So that's kind of my main example, because I think it's just so extremely intuitive and interesting. Anyway, I call this a conceptual disruption. So it's basically, this is honestly, I think forget this long description. I think it's just you don't really know how to classify something. I don't know. Is it adultery? What is it? I don't know how to classify it. And there's no, it's not an empirical question. You can't ask any experts. It's something that I think society has to decide. That's why it's political. But I'm really curious, so how does it occur? I think it's maybe quite a simple explanation, right? So if this is a bit complicated, but just imagine the way you apply your concept, the way you apply your words, is basically by, let's say, like two mechanisms. One is superficial features. If you look at Anita, and I can promise you she acts exactly like other humans, so your prototype of a person clearly applies to Anita. So she looks like a person, she talks like a person, right? Like the person prototype fits. But then you think about, theoretically, it's not really a person, because persons have responsibility, they have agency, but it's not also really, but it also doesn't fit to the prototype of a tool, which has like a hard and rigid surface, so it just doesn't really fit. There are two concepts that almost equally fit, and now we kind of, why are we forced to do this? This is important because it's political, right? Like, you cannot keep this unclassified, because we want to know, did Joe belong to jail, or does he belong to, kind of like sex-positive movement of, that is cool, right? So we need to make a decision because it is so important. And I'm really curious. I was continue to write about this. I was thinking, why is it so? Well, it is conceptually disruptive, but a lot of things are conceptually disruptive. Like the brain death case. Is this person whose body is fine, but the brain is dead? Is this person alive or dead? Didn't take much time to come to a conclusion. We introduced a new label, conceptual engineering of brain death. Fine. But AI seems to be more persistent. Like, there seems to be a persistent conceptual disruption. So why is conceptual disruption in the case of AI so persistent? Why don't we just say, well, Anita is not a person, because we need, persons have, they're humans, because persons have to be organisms. Why don't we just make that decision? So I hope you understand, this is why is it so persistently disruptive to us? And then the first answer is, for it to be at all disruptive. So imagine you go back to our little scheme and you see, okay, my prototype of a person doesn't fit, but I know by theory that she's not a person, so the rational conclusion would be, it's not a person. I made a mistake, I misclassified, right? As we do often, right? Like, if I see a raccoon, or I mistake it for another kind of animal, or I see classify something as a certain tree, and then I realize later, actually, when you ask biologists, it's actually not that tree. So why don't we do the same for Anita? And the first answer is, well, we are all non-reductive physicalists. So in philosophy of mind, that just basically means we don't reduce mental capacity, which is necessary for personhood, right? Like, to be a person, to be an agent, you need certain kind of mental capacities. You need to respond to reason, you need to be able to suffer for you to have rights. It's really important to have a mind. And because we're all non-reductive physicalists, which means that we don't reduce the mind to the brain, and we also are not substance dualists, we are these functionalists, we think it's completely possible that Anita could have a mind. That's why we just don't dismiss this as a weird philosophy thought experiment. No, because actually our theory isn't very clear, because the object theory, the person theory about beliefs and desires is not clear. It could be that a machine has a mind, right? That's what philosophy of mind has been talking about for the better part of the 20th century. But I'm not happy with this answer, because why don't we just still classify, imagine functionalism is correct. Imagine Anita has all the mental capacity that a functionalist would accept as a mind. Why don't we still classify robots as a tool anyway? Right? I mean, it's not logically impossible to then say, okay, it has a mind, but we just simply change our concept of a person. So now you can be a person, and you can have a mind and not be a person. And we do this also with kids. I mean, we know animals. We think animals have a mind, but they're not persons. So why don't we just classify Anita as a tool anyway? And the very, very simple conclusion that I basically worked out in response to Lucas is so simple. I'm embarrassed to even put it on the slide, but I think Esther really doesn't talk enough about it. Well, it's political. We are all liberals. So what is liberalism? So according to Richard Rorty, it's the hope which characterizes modern liberal society. So us, right, all of us, is the hope, maybe not some of us, but is the hope that life will eventually be freer, less cruel, less leisured, richer in goods and experiences, not just for our descendants, but for everybody's descendants. I think the reason we take seriously the question that robots could have rights is because we take rights very seriously. We think you can't just not care about an entity just because it doesn't look like you imagine a person to look like. I think that's very typical of us, right? I mean, we have all these liberal values written down in EU legislation. It's even in front of my university as sort of stones when you enter the university. You have all these nice liberal values. For example, I don't know, tolerance, plurality, you don't want people to suffer. So I think that's why we take it very seriously. So what to do next when we, assuming that everything we talk about is deeply entrenched in political values, and maybe just another thing. If you're Trump, that question is completely absurd, right? That question is yeah, Anita isn't a person. It's not. We shouldn't think about it as a morally relevant entity. We should just exploit it. Why not, right? I mean, if you're Trump, then that problem doesn't occur. It's not persistent to you. It's persistent to us because we're liberals. That's the idea. So what do we do next? We need to do conceptual, what Hermann Veluvenkamp, inspired by Ivo and a lot of people here who do value-sensitive design, we call it value-sensitive conceptual engineering. Here's a very complicated, what is it, like a picture, and we just published that in Meta-Philosophy. So if you're interested in what conceptual disruption, how it can be overcome in a value-sensitive way, you can look at that. That's all I wanted to say. Thanks.
Thank you. Questions for Guido?
Thank you, Guido. I was wondering about your example about adultery or masturbation. So there seems to be an assumption in how you analyze it that it really hinges on what this entity is. Is it the robot or is it the human, and so on. But there might be another argument why people react the kind of behavior, and it's similar to Kant's argument about how we treat animals says something about how we treat humans, and something similar might be going on. So even when it is a robot or not a human, you might say the fact that we treat a person or an entity that maybe somehow looks like or is similar, says something about how we would treat humans. And the more wrong here is not that we mistreating a human. It doesn't matter actually whether it is a human or a robot. It's the kind of attitude that we're expressing in the act that is reprehensible and is morally wrong. So how would that fit your... my question is actually, are you not too much assuming that it is about whether it is a robot or a human, rather than that our behavior towards the thing matters?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I know what you're talking about. Yeah. My answer would be, okay, like, I mean, I'm always thinking, why do we care about this, right? I mean, like, that's kind of the next, like, why should we care about our relationship to the, like, why should we care about, you know, like, whatever we say matters for robot rights. Why do we say that? Why do we care about that, right? And I feel like that's exactly something that is the next step, I think, in Ested. Like, that is the kind of political stuff that then occurs. Like, why, like, what is the political atmosphere that we grew up in, that we do in Ested, that we are deeply embedded in, right? That makes a question by Nolan so relevant, right? That, you know, if you, once you step out of Ested, which is basically a liberal project, if you look at it from a Marxist lens, or an authoritarian lens, or from a totally different, you know, like, I don't know, like a Trumpian America First lens, a lot of these questions get really different answers. That's all I want to say. I mean, I don't know if it's right. And then if you look at it from the Kantian lens, of course, Kant stands for a certain political philosophy too, right? Like why like Sven Nihon now talk about it from that perspective? Like why does he, you know, why is he talking about the way about that he's talking about it? Like that's all. I mean, it's just kind of like asking the next question, right?
But that's more the meta point on which I agree with you.
Yeah.
My point was more about how you analyze the specific case in terms of that it matters whether we classify it as a robot or a human. I wonder whether, for what's at stake, it really matters so much whether we classify it as a robot or a human. I think it is about the kind of attitude that we express to something. That's at the core why we wonder, is this adultery or masturbation? So people can say this is wrong, maybe it is not adultery in the traditional human sense, but the fact that you're willing to, even if you believe it is a robot and it's not intentional and so on, the fact that we're willing to treat it that way says something about how we are willing to treat other humans, and that's wrong.
Yes. Yeah, I think so.
So it doesn't matter whether it is we should classify it as a person or an object. That's not the issue, I would say.
It's what matters, like what matters?
So what matters is what our behavior says about how we're willing to behave towards other humans.
Okay, I might not completely get it, but...
So it's the same if you're willing to rape somebody in a computer game, for example.
I think
no damage done. I mean, so it doesn't matter, but it is the expression of your behavior that is reprehensible.
Yeah, that's the Sven Nihon, that's sort of like what I associate with Sven Nihon, like thinking about, you know, yeah, like I'm not sure we're like talking, because I completely agree, right? I mean, I'm also talking about maybe like going back to like Vibo as really like looking at the factual sort of things you're entitled to when you call someone a person. Like what are the actions that make, like what are the affordances then? What are the actions that this classification makes available? And like what you're talking about like the online spaces is like is already kind of being debated. Like, is that okay to, or like how should we approach someone who does that in like an online space, even if it doesn't matter? Like, it's already like controversial, but what I'm talking about is more like the actual classifications in society right now and what consequences a classification has. And I think that is kind of describing it, right? I mean, if we decided, oh, this is like a full-blown person, we don't call it person, we really classify it as a person as we classify us as persons, then a lot of actions are no longer available to you.
We have a couple of other questions, so let's move to the next one.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. Great. I think you're coming close to making an empirical claim about how some political values influence particular classificatory decisions. But then I'm wondering, so is that in fact true? So would you say that this is somehow empirically testable? And then what would you test? Because on the one hand, you could say that depending on your political values, you make a different choice. But I think some of what you are hinting at is that it's also the, I don't know, the difficulty with which we make the choice. That is actually the empirical difference maker here. So for conservatives, this is an easy choice, hinting at a different classification than what the liberals would perhaps, after endless internal debates, choose on. So is it empirical? And if it is, what exactly is the empirical hypothesis?
I think, yeah, I think it is empirical. It isn't. First of all, I think I like this point about like endless deliberation. Like, right, like us being here is already kind of a sign for being in a liberal space. I think it's for me, it's very like naive, right? For me, it's as of now, just an explanatory hypothesis, right? It's just like, what explains that we still talk about it? Why don't we just dismiss it? If I were Trump, I would just dismiss it as ridiculous. If I were a religious fundamentalist, I would dismiss it immediately, because how can a machine be a person? Because that's not how it is in the Bible, right? Like, I would just dismiss it. So the question is, why is it so persistent? Why are we talking about it, right? And that's my explanatory hypothesis, which I have no answer how to test it. I just think it's obvious, but maybe if it isn't obvious, we need to test it, right? I wouldn't know how to test it. Yeah, but we can also just we can ask like what I just did with Ibo, and like we can ask, okay, why are we actually talking about this, and ask for the justifications people give for keep talking about it. Whereas like Trump would be like, what are you talking about? A tool, like a robot, you know? And yet even if it were a person, like, can we not exploit it? Why not? Like, you know. So we can ask for the justifications people give, and then see what political philosophy it aligns with. Maybe that's like a nice way to test it.
I'm sorry, there are more questions that will still be time to answer, so you don't have to keep your hand up. I've seen you, but let's see how far we get.
Yeah, thank you. So I always like when people try to bring in the political, but I wonder how robustly political your approach actually is, because well, you stay on this level of values, basically. So some values are liberal values, other values are conservative values. But this kind of remains at this level of personal conviction. And of course, you can describe this as political, and you can make all of these like inferences or like comparisons and tie it to different political ideologies. But again, you could also still describe it in this ethical framework of, well, we have these values as opposed to these values. So what I'm kind of missing is this political analysis of hardcore material interests, you could say. Like, how does this all figure in our political landscapes? Why do we have these certain convictions? And I didn't see that, so I was wondering how you would relate that. I'm zero a political philosopher. Okay. Right? That's why you didn't see it. I'm just saying, look, like in certain communities, I don't even want to set an estimate, maybe that's unfair. In the conceptual engineering community that maybe I am most like a fish in the sea in, they don't talk politics very much. I mean, they kind of did, or like when I talk about Sadi Hasslanger, it's all kind of political, but in the end, it's really not political. And I'm just saying, like, wait, there is something else, or like there's something underlying all of this, and then a political philosopher, like maybe Lucas, should come in and then explain to us all the details. But like, I wanted to make a completely naive claim that I think is kind of obvious when you think about it, but like somehow we never talk about it. That's all. But the reason there was no analysis is because I have no expertise in that. Okay.
Behind you, there is another question.
Yeah.
Thank you also for the talk. And I think my question goes more or less in the same direction. It's coming from a political philosopher, actually. My impression is a little bit exactly that liberalism will not solve your problem for the normative claim that certain robots should have rights in a certain way. Because liberalism is kind of a theory that is based on the assumption that we can attribute rights to certain individuals that are humans, right? And I think what you would need to explain is why you would attribute rights, liberty rights, to these humans. And that goes into direction. I mean, it could be a descriptive claim that we think that rights should be attributed, but what's the normative claim? So, for example, you could use the autonomy and the freedom of, or the possibility that these entities make decisions, that they have moral agency, or that they can be responsible, or held responsible for certain acts. So basically, I think that's kind of the direction where you would need to explain why these entities are actually considered parts of the liberal community.
Yeah, but that's what I'm talking about here, right? Like,
I think it's possible, exactly, but liberalism itself would not solve the problem.
I'm not trying. That's not the problem. I'm not trying to solve anything. But I'm just thinking, look, if you're completely right. Like, I mean, to welcome, that's like this. That's what people are talking about. Like, that's what people are not even a lot of the time not even talking about that much. But like, so in robot rights debates, you know, kind of why do you give rights to robots? Why do you help hold them accountable? Like, standardly, you would expect mental states, right? Like, some kind of, you know, will, some kind of like capacity to suffer. So if we were not non-reductive physicalists in philosophy of mind, we would say, no, that's only something that like biological organisms can have. Like, if I'm John Searle, the whole robot rights stuff is completely ridiculous. It's absurd, because how can you be a machine and have a mind? That's ridiculous. But if you are a functionalist, that's not ridiculous at all, right? So that is completely agreed. So like, to welcome them into our liberal community, they would have to have some kind of functionalist mind. But then the question, of course, that's like assuming we're in a liberal community, right? But that's not, we can't, you know, that's what I'm saying. Like, that's like the assumption here that runs the whole game. I mean, I'm not talking normative at all. I'm not making any normative, just like trying to say something in philosophy of language that we don't really say much. It's purely descriptive.
Very brief final question and response.
Yeah, thank you for the talk, and it got me thinking. And I'd like to just add wondering if we wouldn't need to change the analysandum here, because we can discuss all we want about whether that thing or a right object is a person or should be classified as such. But why don't we look at the action of the person? Because suppose, I was reminded of a sketch where someone is carving out a large round hole in a melon, and then suddenly his wife calls that Kennedy has been shot. And he was about to do something with that melon that the guy did with Anita, right? And I'm wondering, if he got cut by his wife, would it matter whether it was a robot, a melon, or a letterbox? Or is it the action? So are we analyzing that situation from the right angle? Because now we're looking at the object, but there's much more, of course, surrounding it.
Wait, so if the action is, like, let's say like there's a basic action, which is like him engaging with this machine, nobody disagrees it's a machine.
No, I'm not saying that at all.
Yeah,
I'm saying we don't even have to ask that question if it's a machine. If his wife caught him doing something similar with a melon or the letterbox,
yeah, but it does
it then matter whether?
It makes a huge difference. So let's say like nobody disagrees it's a machine and a person, right? Like Joe is a person, Anita's machine. The question is the machine a person? If we say in 20 years, okay, machines can be persons for maybe the reasons you just mentioned, maybe there are mental states there, we have to like say, we have to apply our concept of person to that object, then that has different moral consequences compared to when we classify the same action as him having sex with a letterbox or a computer or like a sex doll. I mean, it makes a difference, given our current moral standards. It makes a difference having, you know, I mean, like the way I understand the term adultery right now is just like you can't. It makes no sense to say you commit adultery with a sex toy.
Yeah, but I think that's again looking at it from the wrong angle, because now you're focusing on, is it adultery? Is it a person? But I'm more or less, isn't it about how we expect each other to behave regardless of whether it's a robot or a person, that machine, right?
That strikes me as interesting food for thought during coffee. Thanks a lot,
thanks.
Guido.
No, it's fine. We were way over time.
You off now?
Yeah, well, coffee and then What's it I mean, there are some interesting cross connections between the
Een voorbeeld? Is het zo dat elke sociale rol influencer, de humankind, impliceert? Nou, dat is me niet helemaal duidelijk uit hoe die het opzet. Nou ja, wat voor hem iets een humankind maakt, is die causal significance, of de causal significance. Dus uiteindelijk dat het zodanig belangrijk wordt dat je er een epistemische praktijk op kunt passen. En dat is de vraag of je dat bijvoorbeeld bij een...
Hier liggen er al 3.
Neem even een sociale... Dus hij gebruikt bijvoorbeeld gender als voorbeeld van een humankind. En hij gebruikt niet een invloedende beroepscategorie als
volgens mij in de flut van het podium.
Ik weet niet zeker waar ik bepaalde beroepscategorieën zou plaatsen. Volgens mij dat is een sociale rol.
Dus mijn docent al vrijgegeven.
Oh, echt? En zijn kant is daar gewoon niet helder in. Dat is een van de redenen waarom het voor mij dus niet, in het middendeel van dat schema, daarom zei ik dat ook even, waarom je sociale rollen precies zou willen onderscheiden van je humankind. Ik weet wel waarom je dat niet allemaal zou willen zijn, vanwege die kosten. En sommigen hebben dat echt niet. Dus neem bijvoorbeeld iets als...
Alleen opname.
Was er een klacht over?
Nee, maar de volgende wil niet opgenomen worden.
Oh!
Die wil totaal geen video.
Oh, oké. Weird.
Kan, hey, ik heb een keer een directeur van Efteling gehad en moest een presentatie doen. Dus ja, maar alles gaat op mijn laptop. Alles gaat vanaf mijn laptop. Ja, maar die gegevens mag jij niet hebben van ons. Hè? Dan moet je daarna komen. Ja, ik wil zien of je hem delete. Ja. Ik heb net 3 koffers aan drinken. Ik heb op stand al 6 keer.
Ja, dus ja. Ja, maar deze.
Ja. Dan ga ik even die oude vent zoeken. Video. Weet je waar die zit? Want die mist de zaak ergens een half uur video.
Oh, ja.
Dat wilde ook niet online.
Ja, dat was het.
Wat hè? Ja, ja, staat aan, ja.
Oh ja, was ook over paarden? Ja, toch? Ja, precies. What? What?
What time do you want me to be here for the mic?
Are you in the next segment or after lunch?
2:30, the keynote at 2:30.
At 2:30. Oh, you're the keynote.
Yes.
Then in that case, it's just you, right?
Yeah, just me. Great. Thanks so much. See you in a bit.
Exactly, and I'm the one to fill in. Great. Yeah, so but the real question is why is the workshop tomorrow? There's this big conference. I think it is.
Helemaal omheen. Ik wil hem weten dat hij werkt. Dan kan ik ophouden.
Ja,
Kan ik hem achter het doek leggen, anders valt het niet. Nee, kan je niet onder het doek door?
Yeah, sorry that we did. Really? Good then.
want? Who's Nienke? Yeah. Yeah. She's second, she's first, third. Okay. Nou, voor jou. Ja, dat wijs ik zelf.
En dat is normaal deze mensen.
Leg deze even in je nek en dan zet de haartjes over je oren. Onder je haar. Waar kan het over? Dat ik hier achter in jouw broek
Hier staat die cashbox van vragen. Dus die kun je gewoon pakken en dan...